Hello and welcome to this video. My name is GMAT. I'm a trainer with the International Scholars Program. In today's video, we're going to look at a technique that you could use to determine the correctness of answer choices you select for assumption question types that appear in critical reasoning. So let's begin. Assumptions basically link the argument's premise, the argument's conclusion, right? You're aware that an argument is usually comprised of the premise and the conclusion, right? So most of the time, the premise comes first. The first few sentences will be the premise, then what follows later is the argument's conclusion, right? The definition of a premise is basically any information, any data that the author of that passage will be giving you about the topic. They're trying to educate you about the topic they're discussing, right? Then what follows is the conclusion, which is basically the author's opinion about the topic they discussed earlier. So assumptions basically link this premise to the conclusion. Without this argument will not hold. So these are things that will not appear in the passage itself, but this is information that has to be constant for that argument to hold, right? So correct assumptions to the argument or to the passage presented by an examiner should always or will always strengthen the argument's conclusion, right? You won't find an assumption that weakens the argument itself. Again, remember these assumptions usually breach the ideas presented in the premise to the ideas presented in the conclusion, right? So when you're given an assumption question type in the GMAT exam, you'd always have 5 answer choices to select from. You'd obviously go through them one by one, right? Usually lettered A, B, C, D, and E, right? And you'd go through those answer choices that are presented to you in detail, slowly, making sure that you're reading through, understanding, and trying to see if either of them is the correct answer to the question you asked, right? So most of the time, you select an answer choice, and for some reason, you just want to make sure that the choice you're going for is actually correct, right? Because at the end of the day, you want to get the questions you ask correct so that you can be able to advance or be tested on questions that are on higher difficulty, which usually translates to a high score, right? So to be sure of the answer choices you're given or the answer choices you're going for, you conduct this test, what you're referring to as the negation test. This will help you determine if the answer choice you've gone for is actually correct, right? So you negate your preferred answers and see if your belief or the structure or the order of the argument presented by the examiner is affected, right? If the flow of logic, the flow of ideas is affected by a negation test, then probably your answer is correct, but more likely than not, your answer is correct. If the flow is not affected, then you should be worried, because if you negate the correct answer will always strengthen the relationship that exists between the premise and the conclusion. So if you negate an answer choice and you feel like, and you see nothing is affected, right? It means that in its positive form, that answer choice would be weakening the link or the bridge that exists between the premise and the conclusion, right? So if you negate an answer choice and you see it weakens the logic, weakens the flow of ideas between the premise and conclusion, then that answer choice you're going for is probably correct. But more likely than not, it is correct. So negating the correct assumption will create a void in the argument, right? Meaning the argument will not hold. As I've said, assumptions link premise to the conclusion, right? These are the bridges, right? So if you negate this and you feel like you see there's no link, then be assured that it's correct. But if you negate this and you see the link has not broken, it means in its positive form, this assumption is in the negative form, meaning it does not link the premise to the conclusion. So when do we apply this strategy? Most of the time you do this if, number one, you're in doubt of the answer you've selected, right? You're not sure, probably the question itself is a high difficulty question, right? You need to do or go the extra mile and do a thorough investigation of the answer choice you've selected. How do you do that? You conduct the negation test to see the validity of the answer choice you've selected. This will help you narrow down or be confident with the answer choice that you've gone for. right? When you have time on hand, right? Again, remember, this is a timed exam. So, and most critical reasoning questions, you want to be spending like 2 minutes for each of those questions you're given. So if you have enough time in these 2 minutes, or you'll save time when you're doing other questions, then can go ahead and confirm the validity or the if the answer choice you're going for is actually true. You are able to do the negation test the validity of the answer choice you are going for, right? Then when you're doing a process of elimination, sometimes you narrow down to like 2 answer choices, right? B or D. You're not really sure which of these is correct. So you could conduct a negation test on each of these 2 to see which one, if negated, would affect the flow of reasoning or would affect or break the link between the premise and the conclusion. So if you find that answer choice that breaks the link between the premise and the conclusion in its negative form, then that should be a correct answer.
You are watching Success with Bob Mwiti Show, presented to you by the International Scholars Program. The International Scholars Program is an award-winning international education financing scheme that helps bright students to pursue graduate studies abroad regardless of their financial background. You can find our programs by going to www.internationalscholarsprogram.com. The International Scholars Program, empowering dreams.
Now, let's put this in practice. What you have on your screen, you can pause it and attempt the question, then you can follow the discussion thereafter. The question goes, a famous singer recently won a lawsuit against an advertising firm for using another singer in a commercial to evoke the famous singer's well-known rendition of a certain song. As a result of the lawsuit, advertising firms will stop using imitators in commercials. Therefore, advertising costs will rise since famous singers' services cost more than those of their imitators. The conclusion above is based on which of the following assumptions, right? For every question that is usually asked, or for every passage that is given to you in critical reasoning, always make sure that you're able to distinguish the argument's premise with its conclusion. In this case, you can tell that the premise, that is information that the author is educating us or giving us so that they build up the argument, is starting out from the first sentence of the passage, which reads, a famous singer recently won a lawsuit against an advertising firm for using another singer in a commercial to evoke the famous singer's well-known rendition of a certain song. As a result of the lawsuit, advertising firms will stop using imitators in commercials, right? So this is the argument's premise. It ends there. Then you have the argument's conclusion. Therefore, advertising costs will rise since famous singers' services cost more than those of the imitators, right? You can tell already that you have a conclusion here, a conclusion indicator, right? A subordinating conjunction, therefore. Then what follows is basically an opinion, the author's opinion of the information they presented to us in the premise, right? Now, the question is, the conclusion above is based on which of the following assumptions, right? So we're looking for an idea that will link the argument's premise to its conclusion, right? Answer choice A says, most people are unable to distinguish a famous singer rendition of a song from a good imitator's rendition of the same song, right? Most people are unable to distinguish a famous singer rendition of a song from a good imitator's rendition of the same song, right? So remember what you're looking for. We're looking for an idea that will link the premise to the conclusion. A does not really do that, which is just giving us information about something, right? More or less, it is also to some extent strengthening the argument's conclusion, but not conclusively, really. So for it to be the assumption, it has to have something that holds, right? If it is the case that we can't differentiate the two, then what is the purpose of using probably the singer itself, the singer themselves, or the imitator, right? There has to be a competitive advantage for using one over the other. So A, for that reason, A is out. B, commercials use famous singers. Commercials using famous singers are usually more effective than commercials using imitators of famous singers, right? Again, this B is really justifying what we have in the conclusion, right? Commercials using famous singers are usually more effective than commercials using imitators of famous singers. Then that would defeat the idea being presented in the conclusion about advertising costs being high, right? So if it's successful, then the issue of cost will not be a factor really. So that is not an assumption that will link the argument's premise to the conclusion, right? We look at C, the original versions of some well-known songs are unavailable for use in commercials. The original versions of some well-known songs are unavailable for use in commercials. This actually weakens the argument above, right? So meaning you're looking for an assumption that links the argument's conclusion, the argument's premise to the conclusion. C does not do that. It weakens the argument itself. D, advertising firms will continue to use imitators to mimic the physical mannerisms of famous singers. Right? This is to some extent is out of scope. Physical mannerisms, we're talking about songs here. So D is out by a huge margin. Let's look at E. The advertising industry will use well-known renditions of songs in commercials. The advertising industry will use well-known renditions of songs in commercials, right? Remember, from our passage or our stimulus, this was the premise, and this was the conclusion, right? So E is basically telling us that, yes, whatever has happened in the premise, that is, the famous singer won a lawsuit against the advertising firm for using imitations or imitators in commercials, right? And therefore, the arguments conclude that advertising costs will be high since famous singers' service cost more than imitators. He's telling us that the advertising industry will use well-known renditions of songs in commercials, right? Basically, it is telling us, yes, for the author of the passage to whatever this conclusion, this one has to be true, right? Right? This has to be true for the argument to hold. Without this knowledge, the argument will not hold, right? Imagine, for example, that the advertising industry is not using renditions of these songs. Would there be an issue about famous singers and lawsuits? Definitely not, right? So for this argument to hold, this has to be true for the argument to hold, really, right? So E is correct. It is the link that you're looking for, right? So for the author of this passage to arrive at this, you have to have this information being constant, right? For the argument to hold. Now, let's apply the negation test. Let's apply it to the last choice or the answer choice we feel is correct. E, we have already done it subconsciously, but let's look at this in practice. The advertising industry will use well-known renditions of songs in commercials, right? If you negate this, you'd have the advertising industry will not use, right? We introduce not here, will not use well-known renditions of songs in commercials, right? So if that's the case, then this argument where you're told that advertising costs will be high since famous singers' services cost more than those of imitators would not be an issue, right? Because advertising industry will have options that are not songs from famous singers. So if that's the case, then this argument does not hold, right? It is no longer valid, right? So for that reason, you are able to confirm or justify that E is actually the correct answer, right? So we could also do the same for previous answer choices to see if you negate it, what will happen. If you negate, for example, A, most people are unable to distinguish a famous singer, a rendition of a song from a good imitator's rendition of the same song. If you say people are able, right? Does that does that affect the flow of logic in the argument? No, it doesn't really. It actually strengthens the flow of logic, meaning it is affirmative. This argument or this answer choice is not correct, right? So if they are unable to distinguish, then advertising companies could use imitators and still and avoid the extra cost, right? So the negating A just shows that in the affirmative, whatever information is presented in A is not correct. Looking at B, commercials using famous singers are usually more effective than commercials using imitators or famous singers, right? So if you negate this, commercials not using famous singers are usually more effective than commercials using imitators of famous singers, right? So if that's the case, again, it strengthens the argument's conclusion. right? So, and meaning in the affirmative, B is not accurate or is not correct. C, the original versions of some songs are unavailable for use in commercials, right? So if you negate that, original songs of some commercials are available for use in commercials, yes, then again, that would strengthen the conclusion, meaning in its affirmative, whatever information is in C is incorrect. D was out of scope, so you don't need to use the negation test for that, right? So with that, kindly join us in our GMAT training sessions. We elaborate these strategies, these techniques, and much more in our training sessions. So kindly join the International Scholars GMAT training sessions for that.